What if the most sophisticated form of human intelligence wasn't taught in any classroom? What if it was forged, quietly, painfully, without anyone's permission, in the environments that were supposed to feel safe, but didn't? What if the hypervigilance, the emotional attunement, the ability to read people with an accuracy that borders on unsettling, wasn't a symptom of what happened to you? What if it was the gift that survived it? Today, on Mentor Psychology, we're breaking down traumatic intelligence, the emerging psychological concept that is reframing what trauma actually does to the human mind. Stay with me. Let's dismantle the story that trauma only takes. Because the mainstream conversation about trauma psychology has always focused on what was lost, the safety, the trust, the childhood that should have been different. But beneath everything trauma removed, it quietly built something too. A form of intelligence so specific, so sophisticated, so hard-won, that most people will spend their entire lives never developing it. Here's where the psychology of traumatic intelligence gets fascinating. When a child grows up in an environment that is unpredictable, unsafe, or emotionally unreliable, the brain doesn't shut down, it upgrades. Specifically, the threat detection systems of the brain, centered in the amygdala, become extraordinarily sensitized, hyper-calibrated, trained to pick up signals of danger, emotional shift, and interpersonal tension at a level of precision that a brain raised in safety and predictability simply never had to develop. Neuroscientists call this allostatic adaptation, the brain's ability to fundamentally restructure itself around the demands of its environment. And here's the psychological fact that should reframe everything. Research from the University of Rochester found that children who experienced early adversity demonstrated significantly enhanced ability to read facial expressions, detect emotional incongruence, and accurately predict social outcomes compared to children from stable environments. In other words, the traumatized brain wasn't damaged into hypervigilance, it was trained into perception. The child who had to read the room to stay safe became the adult who reads every room they walk into, automatically, accurately, and with a depth of social intelligence that people around them experience as almost supernatural. And here's the fact that should stop you completely. Psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University, one of the world's leading researchers on human resilience, found that the majority of individuals who experience significant trauma don't just recover. They develop what he describes as a psychological flexibility and perceptual sophistication that trauma-free individuals rarely demonstrate. The brain that survived the hardest environments didn't just endure, it evolved. But the neuroscience only explains the perceptual side of traumatic intelligence. Because beneath the hypervigilance, there's something more profound. Something that doesn't show up in brain scans, but lives in the daily experience of every trauma survivor who has ever been told they feel too much. Psychologists call it affective empathy. The ability to feel what others are feeling, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a visceral, embodied, immediate experience. And in the traumatic intelligence psychology, this empathy wasn't learned, it was survival. The child who had to feel what the adults around them were feeling, before those adults expressed it, developed an emotional attunement that most people spend entire lifetimes in therapy trying to access. And here's the part of traumatic intelligence psychology that almost nobody is talking about. The same neural adaptations that made childhood survival possible don't disappear in adulthood. They don't fade with therapy or time or distance from the original wound. They become part of the cognitive architecture, a permanent upgrade to the perceptual and emotional operating system that the traumatic environment was responsible for installing. Psychologist Mary Ainsworth's foundational research on attachment theory found that individuals who navigated insecure or disrupted early attachments developed significantly more sophisticated interpersonal radar than their securely attached counterparts. Not in spite of the disruption, because of it. And here's the fact that should genuinely shift something in you. Post-traumatic growth researcher Richard Tedeschi at the University of North Carolina found that trauma survivors consistently reported 5 specific areas of profound personal development that emerged directly from their experience: enhanced personal strength, deeper relationships, expanded sense of possibility, greater appreciation for life, and accelerated spiritual or existential growth. Not some of these, all 5, consistently. But here's where traumatic intelligence goes beyond post-traumatic growth entirely. Because post-traumatic growth describes what happens after trauma is processed. Traumatic intelligence describes what the brain built during it, in real time, under pressure, without support, that no amount of comfortable living could have produced on the same timeline. The pattern recognition that spots manipulation before it fully forms. The emotional literacy that translates what people mean beneath what they say. The capacity for nuance in human relationships that only develops in someone who learned, early and at significant cost, that people are complicated, and that survival sometimes depends on understanding exactly how. That isn't damage. That is one of the most extraordinary cognitive profiles the human experience produces. And it was built entirely by you, in the hardest years of your life, when nobody was watching and nobody was helping, and the only tools available were the ones your own mind could manufacture under pressure. Let's talk about a world that only knows how to see trauma as damage. A mental health culture that built its entire framework around what trauma broke, the diagnoses, the disorders, the deficits. That handed the trauma survivor a clinical label before it ever thought to ask what extraordinary things that same nervous system might have built in the process of surviving. PTSD, complex trauma, attachment disorder. All real, all valid, all necessary frameworks for understanding what happened, but incomplete. Because a framework that only measures the wound and never the intelligence that grew around it isn't giving the trauma survivor the full picture of who they actually are. Traumatic intelligence isn't a consolation prize for a difficult childhood. It's a psychological profile that the comfortable, the protected, and the untested will spend their entire lives trying to approximate. Now, honesty matters here. Traumatic intelligence is real, and it is also expensive. The hypervigilance that reads every room accurately is the same hypervigilance that makes rest feel dangerous. The empathy that feels what others feel is the same empathy that makes boundaries feel like betrayal. The pattern recognition that spots manipulation early is the same pattern recognition that sometimes finds threats that aren't there. The gifts and the wounds are not separate. They came in the same package. And recognizing traumatic intelligence doesn't mean bypassing the healing. It means doing the healing with the full understanding of what you're working with and what you're working toward. The goal was never to lose the intelligence. The goal is to carry it without being consumed by it. But for the trauma survivor who is genuinely doing the work, you move through the world with a depth of perception, empathy, and relational sophistication that most people will never access. You see what others miss. You feel what others skim past. You understand the human experience at a frequency that only becomes available to the people who were asked to navigate it without a safety net. That isn't something to grieve. That is something to protect, to refine, and to eventually, deliberately, powerfully, put in the service of something worthy of everything it cost you to develop it. Psychologists call it post-traumatic growth. Neuroscientists call it allostatic adaptation. On Mentra Psychology, we call it traumatic intelligence, the quiet, extraordinary, completely irreplaceable cognitive profile built by the people who had the hardest reasons to become who they are. You didn't just survive what happened to you. You built something from it that most people will never have access to. That wasn't luck. That wasn't accidental. That was you, under pressure, alone, in the dark, building something extraordinary out of the only materials available. And it is one of the most remarkable things a human being can do. Do you recognize traumatic intelligence in yourself? Drop it in the comments. This community was built for exactly this conversation. If this video gave you language for something you've been carrying, subscribe to Mentra Psychology. The next video goes even deeper. Click it. You'll understand why.